All right, everyone. Hello, 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 hello. All right, everyone, hello. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Jason Levine, Principal Worldwide Evangelist for Adobe Creative Cloud, focusing on digital video and audio. And for the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to be talking about some of our VR workflows in Premiere Pro and a couple of cool new things added into After Effects this round as well. So for those of you unfamiliar, we have a whole suite of tools and effects natively inside of Premiere Pro and After Effects that will allow you to take your 360 video, bring it in as equirectangular content, and then edit, cut, process, add graphics, even add things like motion graphics templates to that 360 VR content, and effectively work the way that you always have, except all the while allowing you to build this immersive environment. Added to that, as of the October release, we also added full support for Ambisonic audio, which, as we know, is the spatial audio component to 360 VR, which will allow you to, as you move around in 360 degrees, the sound follows you and gives you this very intense spatial experience, whether you're using a headset or just stereo headphones when watching on YouTube or Facebook. So first, just to kind of show you how you can get started working with VR content. We have a whole new series of presets to get in and then to export and to really make your jobs a lot easier to begin creating. So if you go into our new item icon down here, I just want to show you that down below, if we go into our sequence menu, what you'll see is that we offer about a dozen different presets here, all of which of course are customizable for VR. And this includes all of the standard frame sizes that most of the common cameras out there shoot today. And you can see that we have both supported here monoscopic and stereoscopic. So keep in mind, of course, that you have options with a lot of those cameras shooting monoscopically or in 3D stereoscopic VR. You'll also notice that we have presets here for just standard stereo content or ambisonic content. And it's as simple as taking one of these based on your camera profile, creating a new sequence, and then dragging and dropping your content in. Also, directly from the program monitor or project panel, if we were to say, take this piece of footage right here, Piazza Venice, I can simply right-click and choose New Sequence from Clip. And with our auto-aware VR function, it will automatically know what this content is. Now, if for some reason it doesn't, in your sequence settings here, you can actually tell Premiere, this is equirectangular, you tell it what the layout is, and in terms of stereoscopic content, you have the options of over, under, or side by side. Set your the defaults here for horizontal and vertical captured view, and this now becomes VR content that you can begin playing with. Okay. Now, a couple of new additions that we've made inside our viewer here. So what we're now looking at, this is actually the equirectangular frame. So this is what you have. Many of your cameras today will actually stitch this content for you automatically. There's other softwares that will do this. A lot of the cameras, if they don't stitch it in camera, they have a third-party software that will do it outside of the camera. But what you need to begin working with 360 VR and Premiere is an equirectangular export of that media, which is typically delivered in H.264 and in some cases H.265. Now, if you don't see this button in your program monitor, it's this toggle VR video display, which you can add very easily simply by going to the button editor, that's that plus sign down here, and you're looking for this icon, which you can just drag directly down into the monitor. Now, when I go ahead and turn this on, what you're now seeing, this is our starting orientation point. Now, I'm going to show you in a moment here how you can change those orientation points. This is something that you couldn't do a year ago when we introduced VR. But a lot of people have been asking, well, why is it square? Well, this conforms to sort of the experience inside of most of the Oculus Rift and HTC Vive headsets. Now, all of this can be modified. If we go into the wrench menu here and go into our VR video settings, let's say that you actually wanted to work in a more landscape 16:9 style view, you can adjust the horizontal and the vertical and do something like this and move around inside that 360 space. But again, we've changed the defaults to follow most of the common headset controls out there. Also worth pointing out that in this latest version, you can now use those headsets supported both on Mac and Windows. In the October release, it was Windows only. Now it's both Mac and Windows. All right. So you can see we've got some 360 content here. One of the most common things that people want to do before you begin grading, before you begin doing anything else, is how do I work with 2D elements inside of a 360 comp? Specifically, how do I add things like text? Or how do I add things like additional 2D video? over top of your 360? Well, I've got the beginnings of a motion graphics template here, which I'm going to drop onto another layer here. And again, when we look at this in the equirectangular frame, okay, there it is, kind of sitting right there. If we now go into our VR viewer, however, you're going to see that that's all bent and skewed, and that's not the way that should be. That's because, by default, Premiere doesn't know what to do with this content. You actually have to use an effect that we give you natively called VR plane to sphere, which ultimately converts that two-dimensional object into a 360 object. So up in your effects, in both After Effects and Premiere, all you have to do is simply type VR, and now you'll see a couple of dozen effects and video transitions, because as you might guess, you can't just use standard dissolves and things in 360 content. They have to work in 360 degrees. So we give you a whole series of new dissolves and things to use in the 360 domain. So to begin with configuring this graphic for 360, I'm going to come over here and we're going to select VR plane to sphere. I'll drop this over top of my motion graphic, and now you can see it gets very small. So let's go over to our effects controls. I'm just going to expand this a little bit so I've got a little more screen real estate. And first thing I'm going to do is scale this up. All right? Now, I don't particularly like the position of this. In fact, what I really want to do is reorient that graphic along the wall, and I kind of want it to be positioned on that wall there. So you'll see inside of the VR plane to sphere, first of all, you can choose the frame layout. We know that this is monoscopic. Stereo disparity, again, monoscopic, we don't have to worry about that. Then you have rotate source and rotate the projection, because that's ultimately what we're doing, is we're projecting this 2D object into this 360 sphere. So to move it inside the 360 sphere, I'm going to adjust my projection pan and reorient it along the wall. Okay? Something like that. And again, at this point, I could maybe scale this down so it fits between the windows if I wanted to. Maybe something like that. Okay? Keep in mind, of course, that you still have access to things like opacity. So if we wanted to, say, overlay this, something like that, along our wall so it looks a little bit better, we can do that as well. I can also readjust the actual position right here. All right? So now, when I move around, it stays oriented along the wall as expected. And if I play this back, and by the way, I can just extend the duration of this right about there. All right? Go ahead and play this back. As I move around, you can see it stays oriented on position along the wall right there, and here it will hide away. And we could make it reappear on the wall along there. Okay? So very easy to take any kind of 2D object and orient it into the 360 space via plane to sphere. All right? Now, taking that a step further, let's go to this piece of content here. All right? So we're transitioning from several different pieces of VR content. Here we have the gondola, okay? And right now, let me go ahead and go into our VR video settings. Oh, not settings, sorry, our VR video controls here, which, again, in the previous version, about a year ago, we enabled these by default. Now, the reason we don't keep these on by default is because this takes up a lot of screen real estate. But what this will allow me to do is to reset that orientation position, right? Now, the thing about orientation is you might be filming this way, or that way, but ultimately you actually want the viewer to experience what's happening from some other position. So again, previously, in last year's version of VR, you had no way to change that orientation point, that starting point. Well, now it's very, very simple to do that. There's nothing happening in the front of the gondola here. So why would I want that to be my orientation point? So just to ensure that we're at the start point, you can see here we're at 0 degrees horizontally and vertically. I'm going to turn those controls off for a moment. I'm just going to go and hide them. All right? And let's now go back to our effects, and we're going to choose, this time, VR Rotate Sphere. Drag this over top of our clip, over to Effects Controls, and you'll see, again, some similar options here for tilt, pan, and roll. And in this case, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to pan along that y-axis, and perhaps I want this to be our starting point with these creepy clowns in the back of the boat. So now, when I start creating, or when the user goes to YouTube, this is where it begins. They don't have to spin around to start there. You've just changed the starting point. How can we verify that? We'll go back into our VR video, show controls, and again, you can now see we are at 0, 0. So we've non-destructively changed that orientation point. Now, you may have noticed in here that in all of these parameters, you have the familiar animation icon here. So what does that mean? Well, that means, of course, that all of these things can be keyframed. You can actually move the orientation as someone is theoretically moving around. Now, as someone who suffers terribly from motion sickness, this might make you vomit. Be very careful when animating inside a 360 sphere. But you can, in fact, do that. So let's just say that we wanted to set a keyframe. We'll start it at the top of our video, right about here, like this. And then maybe halfway through the cut, we'll actually have it return to the front of the boat here. All right, you can see it automatically draws that other keyframe. Maybe we'll even park it into position. Use a little ease here. Again, not something that you would necessarily do, but I think you get the idea. And you can see that as it plays, it's moving, but you could still be turning your head inside the headset as it's moving. Lots of movement. Look at this, crazy things going on here. Again, if we want to see what's above, beautiful blue sky, very easily, very quickly, and it just works, okay? Now, in terms of moving between cuts, I was just talking about setting transitions or using different types of effects. So we have lots of different effects here inside of our VR selections that you can use as a combination of transitions or just transitional elements. We're really using these things to move you through the sphere. You have to think a little bit differently when you think about transitioning cuts in a VR edit. The workflow is the same. How you cut, how you trim, how you apply color correction, that's the same. That's the brilliance of this workflow. But in terms of authoring, telling your story, we're really using these not to just cut from scene to scene, but to move you from place to place, from position to position. And you have to be a little more conscious of that smooth movement. Laughing to myself, thinking about smooth movement. All right. So down below, again, under VR Immersive Video Transitions, you'll see that we have a couple of different options here. My particular favorites are light leaks, light rays, iris wipe. These are some pretty common ones. Let's start with these light leaks. So again, just like working on regular content, I can come over here. I can add my transition. Again, you use the same technique to extend that transition. And if I wind back and hit play on this, right, we use a nice little light leak there to transition between scenes. And just to kind of show you, again, how it's different inside the equirectangular frame, so you can really understand that it's not just transitioning in a linear fashion, it's transitioning top to bottom, left to right in every angle. Watch what's happening here. You can see how it's actually performing, again, across all elements of the frame, very smoothly today, I might add as well. So again, the workflow doesn't change, but how you move through the scene changes. Now we've got a lot of different options here, as I mentioned before, but something else that I like to use is this one here. This one's really fun, this digital glitch. I'm going to drag this over top of our Venice content here. All right? So here we have our glitchy content. And down below you can actually see, again, in our options for VR Digital Glitch, got your point of interest, scale, aspect, master, amplitude, random seed, all of which can be keyframed. So here's an option where you might actually want to use a little bit of keyframed movement to maybe use this as a different type of transition. Now, I sometimes like to add these effects when looking at the equirectangular frame so I can see exactly what it's doing across all points before it transitions. So perhaps, maybe halfway through this clip, I'll set a keyframe to increase our amplitude maybe something like this. Or in fact, here, you know what? Let me undo that. I've got a better idea. I'm going to start at the beginning of the clip here, and I'm going to crank the amplitude way up. So it's super glitchy. So it's transitioning into this very glitchy, kind of crazy background. But then, and maybe I'll even shrink this up while I'm at it, make this a shorter cut. All right, a little bit of a trim there. I'm going to set a keyframe on this. And as it transitions to here, we'll reduce the amplitude there, bringing back all of those pieces. All right? Again, using this as an effect, but also as a transitional element. Something like that. And again, we could even move these a little bit closer. Maybe this one, that's a bit high, so maybe we'll drag this down a bit more. Okay? Something like that. Go back to effects, and maybe for this one, we'll use something like the iris wipe. Now, the iris wipe may seem very 90s to you, but if you look at YouTube, it somehow works in this 360 environment. And as we're transitioning from glitch to this, there's just something kind of visually pleasing about it. So now, if we go back into our VR viewer, play this back, transition from the gondola to the glitchy piazza, which starts to have all the pieces come back together, to the iris with our Venice in the summertime parented along the wall. The key to all of this here, friends, is that your workflow for editing is exactly the same. It's just understanding some of the techniques behind leveraging these features. And you can see everything from sharpen, to glow, to fractal noise, to denoise, to color gradients, to chromatic. This is adding chromatic aberration, right? We use Camera Raw and Lightroom to remove chromatic aberration from imagery. Here, we're adding it into the frame. Blur. Why do we have a separate VR blur? For the same reason I showed you with the glitch and the transitions. Because it's not just blurring linear side to side, it has to blur everything. So you've got specific different types of effects, all for VR, but they all work exactly the same. All right? Now, when it comes to audio, here's where you now have some very cool options that you can leverage inside of Premiere Pro. And we're talking about Ambisonics. So Premiere Pro, much like wanting to use equirectangular frames for its video, we are looking for AmbiX, high order Ambisonics, type 1, for Premiere Pro's timeline. There's a couple of different plugins and encoders out there that will spit out AmbiX content. If you shoot with something like the Zoom H2N, very popular recorder, there's a firmware update for that. This has become a real standard for capturing Ambisonic audio in this AmbiX format. Sennheiser, they make that Ambisonic 4-channel microphone, also has a companion piece that will export the AmbiX content for you. This is what Premiere Pro is looking for to leverage your Ambisonic audio. Once you have that, it's simply a matter of creating your, again, those sessions are already pre-created. You can see we can drag that Ambisonic audio into our mix here, 4 channels, and you're good to go. Now, inside the track mixer here, you have a couple of different options. Now, new, again, in this version as of October was, you now have an option here to monitor Ambisonics. So if you are working with a headset, as you're cutting and moving around, you can now live monitor the Ambisonic audio. This is something you couldn't do before. Also, if you have content where you need to reorient something in your Ambisonic recording, just in the same way that we rotated the sphere of the video content, you can also reconfigure, rotate, tilt the position of how your Ambisonic audio is captured. And there's 2 different ways that you can do that. If we go down to our special menu here, you'll see that we have something called the Ambisonic binauralizer. Now, this is what we would have used previously to monitor the Ambisonics. This basically takes your 4-channel Ambisonic soundtrack and in stereo headphones allows you to hear what it would sound like once it's encoded, okay? Because, again, prior to being able to monitor it directly, this effect is now slightly unnecessary, although you can still use this if you're planning to put stereo content inside of your, alongside of your Ambisonic content. But if you're wanting to change the relative position of things, I had someone recently who filmed something in the desert, and they had the H2N going the opposite direction. So the audio, it was backwards from the camera, okay? So you can go into the Ambisonic panner here, and let's go into our effects controls. Oh, sorry, I don't want that on our, my bad. I want that on the clip itself. We'll type in Ambisonics here, panner, drop it on our Ambisonic wave file, down here. So again, here's where you can now adjust the pan, tilt, and roll, reconfiguring the position of that original recording. This is also where you can keyframe and move things around. As I said before, when you're dealing with Ambisonics, which ultimately when you're playing this back on YouTube or Facebook, this is being decoded as binaural audio. Anybody ever work with binaural recordings? Binaural? Not many? No, really? Well, I did this years ago. Binaural, which is what you are hearing when you're listening back. Well, I'm not going to give you the history on that. It's been around for more than a century. It only requires stereo to listen to. And it gives you, they used to use these heads, you've probably seen them, these little mannequin heads that had specific microphones in the ears to capture sound the way your brain and ears interpreted them, which is why it could do this amazing spatial type audio. Spatial sound has been around for decades. Very popular in the 70s, disappeared for a while, reemerged in the 90s when VR was 8-bit and not so great. And it's come back now, but in the form of Ambisonics, and when it's encoded and decoded, we're now listening via binaural. That's why we have the binauralizer. It's also very taxing on the ears over time, so again, you want to take breaks when monitoring and moving things around. Movement with Ambisonic audio, much like VR content, needs to be subtle, otherwise, if you get my meaning. All right, so you have your Ambisonic panner here. You have the ability to reconfigure the audio. If you want to, again, play this back on a loudspeaker system, this is where you might take something like that binauralizer here and play this back. And what you'll see when I add that, you're now only going to see the output on 2 channels, because again, this is what your converted sound will be represented as when you're listening on YouTube. Okay, this is what you would be hearing. So kind of cool there, all right? Now, we, as mentioned, have headset support here in Premiere on both Mac and Windows. But in the latest version, you also have that support, which you can actually see for yourself just behind me here, and we call it the Adobe Immersive Environment, directly here in After Effects as well. So if you're designing content for After Effects in VR, you can monitor in real time what you're doing as well. Very useful and consistent with the workflow in Premiere. Additionally, a lot of people ask, well, what if I need to convert it from equirectangular to, there's all different flavors of VR. What about cube? What about spherical? Well, you'll notice here in After Effects, we have something called the VR converter. I can drop this over top of my clip. I can set the input, which is equirectangular 2:1, and then I can change the output to something like a cube map, or a sphere map, or fisheye, full dome, okay? Lots of different flavors. You can leverage the VR converter to spit those out as well, okay? And when you're ready to actually export your content, File, Export, Media, we're going to go into H.264. Also worth pointing out, in this release, accelerated decode for H.264 and HEVC. You'll notice in our presets, we've vastly cleaned up our preset menu, and down at the bottom here, we have VR monoscopic with Ambisonics or stereo, or stereoscopic with Ambisonics or stereo. If we were to go here with our Ambisonic audio, again, here's where inside of the video tab you can see the various bit rates that it's using, and to ensure that you have true Ambisonic audio, you'll see down below that it's automatically got the checkbox enabled. Audio is Ambisonics, and here, video is VR. This is also where you can verify that you're exporting monoscopic, stereoscopic over, under, or side by side. So my friends, that's all the time I have. If you want to check out more with our VR workflows, visit my friend Dacia on the other side of the booth here. Thank you very much, and I'll see you back in a half hour with Premiere Pro. Thanks, everyone.